ACT podcast. We are here today to discuss the implications of the CAS review, a landmark and comprehensive assessment commissioned by NHS England in 2020. And most of our listeners, I imagine, will be familiar with the review. The issues have been impacting education for a number of years now. Transgender issues, gender identity materials and the curriculum make up a large proportion of our communications with members. Well, we're here to speak with some specialists in the area who can give us a bit more of an insight into what's happening, what the report says, and how we can respond. I've got Julie Maxwell, who is a community paediatrician, member of the Church of England General Synod, lots of experience in church youth work, and apparently trustee of the Family Education Trust. Julie, anything I've missed out there?
Lovewise. I work for Lovewise.
Sorry, yes, absolutely. You work for Lovewise. What is Lovewise?
Lovewise is a Christian charity which seeks to support churches, parents, youth groups and schools to teach about sex, relationships and marriage from a Christian perspective.
So Julie has a wealth of knowledge, medical knowledge, spiritual insight, and some great insights into to youth, to health, well-being within the church, but also wider society. And we've also got Steve Beegoo, who is Head of Education at Christian Concern and the CEO of the Christian Schools Trust.
Good to be with you, Lizzie. Great.
It's lovely to have you here. You've been a primary head teacher, a pastor. I mean, when I look at your CV, Steve, I don't know how you've managed to fit all of this in.
a lot of things ran in parallel. I'm not in my late 70s quite yet, which
Which is 60s. So yeah, let's dive in. This review has obviously you can't have been naive to the fact that this review has been published in the last couple of weeks. As I said earlier, it's landmark. It seems to have caused a lot of discussion online within just mainstream society, but also within Christian communities and in particular within education communities. I'm just wondering if we could discuss what it was, what it did, why it was needed, what happened.
Well, I mean, I think it came about because, firstly, I think people were starting to get concerned about the massive increase in children presenting with gender dysphoria. So the Gender Identity Development Service at Tavistock couldn't cope with the influx of referrals they were getting. So I think that was the kind of primary sort of thing that set this in motion. And then there was an increasing kind of realization that the method of managing and treating these children was not evidence-based. So as a result of that, the NHS England commissioned this independent review to just kind of look at what was going on at Tavistock. So there was kind of concerns about the way things were being managed. And so Hilary Cass was, as a previous president of the Royal College of Paediatrics, she was tasked with the unenviable job of collecting the sort of all the evidence that they had, looking at everything that was going on, looking at how children were being treated, what the evidence was. And it was supposed to have been done a lot quicker, but it was a monumentous task that I think was much bigger than even she was expecting, and so took 4 years.
And so there was a response.
Oh, I'm sorry, Steve.
Whoa.
Could you just maybe turn down your volume? I will as well. I think sometimes that happens if it's a bit too loud. Don't worry, we'll be able to cut that bit out. Try again.
So I think I'm right in saying, Julie, that there was a huge skyrocketing, wasn't there, of those that were being referred, and the NHS was trying to respond to that. And there are obviously some issues in society whereby gender identity ideology had started to come in, and many children were starting to think this is a silver bullet to solve all my problems, and then the NHS was being so overwhelmed with kids and young people needing that, and so the NHS was trying to catch up in trying to work out how to respond, but then the NHS itself seemed to be being influenced by those who had quite strong gender ideology based views. Is that right, Julie?
Yeah, yeah. It's exactly. It seems that exactly what's happened. We just saw this, huge rise of children expressing these difficulties that had never been there before, and it also moved from just being around about slightly over 50% of those being referred were boys, and were mostly pre-pubertal, to then being around 75 to 80% girls, and mostly teenage girls. So almost like a completely different cohort even. So the children that were being referred were different children to those that the clinic was basically set up for. And the way they were being managed was completely different as well. And I think, like you say, Steve, the ideology that we were seeing in schools and in society was also there within the NHS. And I think I first got involved in this really back in about 2017 when I went to some training at the Tavistock, and I still got all the notes from it, which is really interesting. So they were raising the concerns about the massive increase, the concerns about the teenage girls, and the concerns about how they were being treated, and the unknowns around puberty blockers and all of those things. They were raising those at the Tavistock back in 2017. And what shocked me most, because I was already thinking all that, what shocked me most was that they were saying this at this training, but they were still doing it.
Yeah.
And of course, what the CAS review has now done is to say, yeah, these were concerns, and no, we weren't dealing with it properly. So yeah, it's been a long time coming, the evidence that's come out.
Absolutely. Well, and it really does, it delivers quite a sobering critique of the care provided to many vulnerable children. And I think just to add some context as well to the numbers of children being referred. So apparently in the span of a decade, referrals escalated from under 250 young people in 2012 to over 5,000 by 2022.
Incredible.
And obviously that's quite a significant increase. And I suppose questions are starting to be asked, but yet why on earth were people so reticent to provide and to ask questions and perhaps halt, you think, some of these treatments that were inadequately supported by evidence, or there just wasn't any evidence?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that kind of really comes out in the CAS review report is that we didn't follow kind of normal clinical protocols on this. So we didn't follow the way the usual clinical practice would be, which would be to practice evidence-based medicine. And I think Hilary Cass mentions the sort of toxic debate, and the fact that people were afraid. I mean, I've spoken to medical colleagues since who said, I referred a child to the Tavistock. I wasn't kind of comfortable with it at the time, but I felt like I had to do it because I might get reported to the GMC if I don't. So I think people were afraid, and people were afraid to, because basically what's happened is that anybody who raises a question about the treatment of children with gender dysphoria is labelled transphobic.
Yeah.
And that's basically what happens. I mean, it's sad, but true.
One of the things that really stands out to me as I read the CAS report is how often the word unknown appears. So just quote a little bit here. When it comes to puberty blockers, which is one of the main sorts of medical interventions that were being provided for children who are thinking that they should be the other gender, when it comes to those puberty blockers, the rationale for early puberty suppression remains unclear, with weak evidence regarding the impact on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health. The effect on cognitive and psychosexual development remains unknown. And there are statements like that over and over and over again in the CAS review. So essentially, the National Health Service was thoroughly recommending treatments to children where there was an unknown There was no decent evidence base as to what was going to happen as a result of it.
And I think another point in there as well is that not only that is that pre all of this puberty blockers and sort of affirmation of gender identity, the vast majority of children with gender dysphoria would in fact kind of grow out of it as they went through puberty, and so even for that small number that don't grow out of it and continue to have gender dysphoria, the evidence even for them is weak. But of course, what has been happening is that all of them are being treated, not just, you know, and one of the kind of phrases from the review which particularly struck me was it says the evidence is weak, as you just said, Steve, and clinicians have told us they are unable to determine with any certainty which children and young people will go on to have an enduring trans identity. So, you know, both of those things together make the whole thing totally unacceptable.
Absolutely. So we can see then that there's been this explosion. I started teaching back in 2010, 2009, 2010. When I started teaching secondary schools, I hadn't heard of any child who was struggling with their gender identity, and I didn't have anyone in my lessons who wanted to be identified as using a different name or different pronouns, etc. When it came to about 2015, 16, started to get messages in staff briefings that a certain student had now identified as the opposite sex, and we are to treat them as the opposite sex. Now, I personally never had one of those children in my lessons, and I think I'd have struggled to know how to treat them if I had, with the information that I was given at the time. And I personally never came into contact with a student, although I do know of other family and friends who are, or you know, who have gender dysphoria. But what would we say the state of the matter has been in schools? Because our listeners will largely be those interested in education and how to respond to this from a Christian perspective. How have teachers been struggling? Steve, obviously you will have a really good kind of heli view of this issue, being involved in so many areas of education.
Well, yeah, as head of education at Christian Concern, we're getting regular information from teachers that are explaining to us what they're being asked to teach in this area, as well as the issues that they're facing with many children and young people with gender dysphoria, having this gender ideology belief system that is underpinning who they believe they are. And I mean, just before this call, I was trying to construct an email, trying to help a parent who is trying to get transparency around the curriculum in her secondary school, and the school is essentially refusing to allow them to copy any of the information, because this parent, and I think the school, realised that if she were to be able to do that and pass that on to other parents, they would be really upset and concerned about the gender ideology stuff that the teachers are peddling inside of that school. And we have those things every week. We have some kind of situation like that related to schools. It might be that parents are struggling with what's being done with their own children in the school setting. And we've had a really helpful step forward in some ways with the gender questioning children guidance, which has come out recently, which is in draft form, and the consultation on that ended last month. That said some really helpful things around gender ideology being a contested belief, and that you shouldn't be using different pronouns for children that are biologically male or biologically female. You're not required to socially transition. There's no requirement around that. And a lot of that gender questioning children guidance directly for schools has been shaped as a result of work such as that done by Dr. Hilary Cass, as well as some helpful politicians such as Miriam Cates and others, really highlighting the level and the scale at which this gender ideology is really embedded within so many schools, and many unions and many LGBT organizations are still saying no, you must affirm, you must socially transition, you must do all of this stuff. Even with the Cass review and the report that's come out, even with the gender questioning children draft guidance that's coming out. So there is something that's been really embedded in the school system. One classic story around all of this was, I mean, way back in 2015, Cornwall provided some transgender guidelines that were based basically from some of these organisations, and these trans activists had been peddling all sorts of guidance to local authorities. That Cornwall guidance was being used in the Isle of Wight. And a really serious case that we've seen at the Christian Legal Centre with Christian Concern with Nigel and Sally Rowe came to us, where a 6-year-old boy in their son's class had started to sometimes come dressed as a girl, and their children were upset about this. Them as parents, they were upset about this. They were wondering what their Church of England school was doing by doing this. And the Church of England guidance called Valuing All God's Children, which had also been shaped by Stonewall, was influencing that school. And they were treated terribly and called transphobic and all the rest of it. And so that was guidance from 2015. They came to us a couple of years later, and it's took about 7 years before eventually the Department for Education settled with them out of court that actually what they had been saying all along in pushing back against this kind of guidance, this kind of what the school were doing, was wrong, and they gave them a financial settlement outside of that. So we've seen some pushing back that has occurred, but it's still thoroughly embedded, this way of thinking, inside all sorts of the way in which the curriculum is being carried out, the way in which schools are operating when they have children who are gender questioning.
And I think the situation in the NHS has made that worse as well, hasn't it? Because I think people up until now assume, up until this stuff kicked off, I assumed that if a treatment was taking place in the NHS, particularly a treatment for children, it must be evidence-based. Yeah. So even though I felt unhappy with it, I assumed it must. And I think that's the thing. People thought, well, okay, well, this must be a real medical condition, and this must be the proper medical treatment. So therefore, even if I feel a bit uncomfortable about it and I'm not sure about some of this ideology stuff, well, I better go along with it. So I think, teachers have been in a very, very difficult position because, medics haven't known what to do with this. A lot of my colleagues were horrified by a lot of this stuff. They assumed that the Tavistock was operating on evidence-based guidelines. And so I think, it's no wonder schools have been really, really struggling, and parents as well.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely a really good point. Sorry, there's a bit of echo there. One of the things that we picked up on when my husband, who's a governor at our children's school, we picked up on some lessons that were included in the PSHE curriculum, and one standalone lesson on gender identity. And we were quite surprised about this because we know that the leadership, we know the head well, we know the nature of the staff who work there, and they're not ideologically driven at all. So when my husband questioned this in a governor's meeting, they just said, we thought that's what we were supposed to be doing. We got some advice and we thought that's what we were supposed to be doing. And when my husband explained to them perhaps why it's contentious, how people didn't always agree on these issues, and actually how it could potentially even be harmful, they were really responsive and took the lesson out straight away. But they were just doing what they thought they should be because that's what other organisations were advising. And I think that is so often the case. Not all teachers are left-wing ideologues. Not that there's anything wrong with being left-wing, but they're not all ideologues when it comes to, embracing kind of progressive and unscientific ideologies. Lots of them aware aren't aware of what they're truly meant to be doing, because there's been a bit of a lack of guidance. But
there's also been, since the introduction of relationships education, relationship section, health education, there'd been schools were inundated with organisations, Stonewall-like organisations up and down the country, of which there are scores, that flooded their resources into those schools, often with gender ideology-based beliefs in the curriculum that's embedded in there. So the schools were flooded with these things at a point at which they had to deliver a new curriculum. And where there are activists present in school, and they lap those things up, and we're starting to push those things out with immunity, because nobody would dare speak against the ideologies that they were pushing forward for fear of being seen as being transphobic and therefore losing their jobs. So there was a at the point at which all of this stuff was pouring into schools, there was also this huge fear and silence. Hilary Cass highlights this kind of this fear and this silence and the polarizing of the debate,
Yeah.
in which we're kind of functioning now. Schools had a real issue around all of that at that time, and that has remained. And it's going to take some courageous teachers and some courageous people like yourself raising these issues with school governors, with heads, to say, check out the advice that you've been given, who's it been given by, and can we review this again, please? You have a right to be consulted. If you're a parent listening to this, you have a right to be consulted about what is going on in your school in relation to relationship, sex and health education, and you have a right to complain. You do also have a right to see the stuff that they're peddling in your school. Gillian Keegan herself wrote to schools, so you must be transparent around this kind of area. So in replacing that kind of fear, we do need to kind of raise up with a bit of courage. And there's things like the Cass report the Cass review that we're looking at today. These things can help us, give us some, ammunition's a strong word, but give us some evidence to go to them and say, have you seen this? Do you know about this? This is really concerning that this has been going on. What are you doing in this kind of area to safeguard our children?
Absolutely. So listen, the detail of the review, the report, the findings really do have big implications for treating children and young people. But why, as Christians, should we be thankful for that? How does the emphasis on the importance of this evidence-based care, how does that align with what we know in the Bible about identity, about responsibility towards vulnerable populations? How can we be particularly thankful?
I think for me, as the sort of the medical side of it, the first thing is that biology backs up what the Bible says. We are created male and female, and we're created by God, and it's God that gives us our identity, and that if we don't look to God for identity, we are floundering in the dark. Really, we've kind of got to find it from somewhere, which is why people sort of kind of look inside themselves, I suppose, to try and find an identity, and obviously that causes huge amounts of problems. But the differences between men and women are huge. We are both human beings, but the differences are significant. And in medicine they are massively significant, even down to things like risk of illnesses, or the way drugs work, or the sort of the dosage that you need. They're all dependent on whether you're male or female, so it's vital to know whether you're male or female. So the science backs up what the Bible tells us, but also as Christians, our biggest responsibility is towards the vulnerable and towards the children who are the most vulnerable, aren't they? And to protecting them. And so when like I did, and many others sort of realised that something terrible was going on, and that children were not being protected, you have to speak out and do something, whether even when it means you might get into trouble for it. And so I think and the Cass review, I think, is really encouraging in that it gives us something else to argue with, as well as our Christian faith in the Bible. And it sort of backs us up, which is not surprising, is it really? Our creator God designed the universe, he knows how it works best, and so it's not surprising therefore that scientific evidence actually backs up what the Bible says.
A real issue around truth, and there are some things that are true and there are some things that are not true, but that belief that I've just expressed to you isn't now believed by many people in a postmodern culture. They don't think there are some things that are true and there are some things that aren't true. They believe that everybody has their own truth, and what's true for you is true for you, and that's fine. That's your own truth. Whereas science is wonderful because you can observe things and you can tell that things are true or they're not true, that some statements are more accurate than other statements. And this is observable truth. The Bible itself talks about observing things. Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, having been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." And so it continues. It's basically saying you can observe things that are true in creation. And these things, therefore, can point you to God's invisible qualities, the visible things pointing towards invisible qualities. There's scientific observable truth that the Bible highlights is important. And then there's, of course, biblical truth. All scripture, Timothy says, all scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching. The Bible is very clear that there are male and female. Biological observation is very clear that there's male and female through chromosomes. These are ways of understanding truth. Absolute truth exists. Whereas what we're seeing in culture is this contested belief of gender identity basically says, I create myself. There isn't a creator God who creates male and female. The person who creates is me. And even in schools, with a 7-year-old child, nobody else knows who you are. The doctors don't know who you are. They just assigned you some kind of term for you when you were born, but you're the one who really knows who you really are in your pseudo soul that you've got inside of you called your gender identity. And this is what our kids are being taught. It's a completely different belief system that it flows from, that is kind of a post-truth world. And it leads to doctors and parents and children and young people trying to change themselves, and even experimenting on what might be done in order to find out who they really are and find the best way to flourish in life. Whereas God shows us through his biblical truth, through the truths of the scriptures, who we really are, that we are fallen and we do need changing, but there's a way that we change in response to Jesus Christ. And this is the true way to flourish as an individual, not just in this life, but forever, as we respond to Jesus Christ and his healing of us and his saving of us and his forgiveness of us. And so it's a completely different worldview story that we come from as Christians that is really the true antidote of the gospel to the issues and problems which everybody faces, not just gender dysphoric children.
Great points there, Steve. And I guess we could say then that the issue of gender is a particular symptom at the moment of our deepest need to understand who we are as humans made in the image of God, with a creator who loves us, who desires for us to be back in relationship with him giving us that worth and that identity. How can we, though, as teachers, as Christians, say many of our members will be in mainstream secular, although I know no school is truly secular, schools, now that they have this to kind of lean on, they have some, as well as the scriptural, the biblical truths, they have the CAS review. How can they perhaps go a step further and perhaps start to pick apart why people have been searching around for something to cling onto? How can they do that in a way that doesn't land them in hot water?
Well, I'd say the first thing is to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, to be following him with your life in your work environment. It's very tempting for us to live in boxes nowadays, where we do our Christian stuff on a Sunday, maybe do something a bit at home, but try to avoid talking about anything to do with that in our workplaces. And I think Christians and Christian teachers need to rediscover a confidence about being a disciple and a follower of Jesus Christ in every aspect of life, be that in your badminton club or your online social community or in your workplace, which is where we spend an awful lot of our time, especially teachers, who I discovered the other day work on average 11 hours of unpaid work every week. They're doing huge amounts of work in the school environment and even outside of school. And to be exhibiting that we are followers of Jesus Christ, praying for our teacher friends when they're in challenging circumstances, difficulties, praying with and for our head teachers, living out the faith in a wonderful way, where we're demonstrating the love of Jesus Christ, the forgiveness of Jesus Christ in all sorts of wonderful ways. Then when we do need to stand up and be bold, then we're listened to, because they see and they know something different about us. Yeah. Our role, though, isn't to just be totally unoffensive the whole time. Sometimes we need to say things that we know will cause others to disagree. We can present the truth in love, but we must present the truth. We're called to do so. Jesus Christ came full of grace, yes, but he came full of grace and truth. If we don't bring the truth, we're not actually bringing the full grace of Christ. If we're not bringing the truth, are we being truly loving towards those children and people in our communities who are vulnerable and who are struggling? By not telling them the truth, are we hiding something from them? And I think there are many Daniels and Esthers out there in our schools who have sought to live out this kind of way, seeking to follow Christ in difficult circumstances. But there comes sometimes for such a time as this, for each one of them, as there was for Esther, where they needed to say what was going on and call it out. In the story of Esther, it's done in a very interesting kind of way. I mean, read that story if you're thinking you might be an Esther at this moment in time. And for Daniel, he had obviously worked inside that system that wasn't based on biblical foundations at all, but he'd served really well. But then there came a moment when he needed to say, actually, no, I am going to pray. I'm not going to bow down to your gods. I'm not going to worship what you worship. I'm going to pray in the way that the Lord's called me to pray. And he let people see him do that. And at that moment, he got thrown to the lions, didn't he? At Christian Concern, we're regularly supporting bold and brave Christians who have been prepared to take their discipleship and following of Jesus Christ seriously enough to put themselves in some difficult circumstances at times, and where they have seemingly offended others. We don't offend deliberately, just to be offensive, but there might be moments where we need to have the courage to speak the truth, and that might be what you're saying, Lizzie. Is there ways that we can step forward and go further?
Yeah. I mean, I would just jump in there and say that that's why I think it's so important to be encouraged and to be in community with others who are like you. You know, the Lord gives us one another for encouragement, and I would encourage those that are listening, if they're not a member of ACT, or even if they're not in touch with other Christians who are working in education, who can encourage them, who can help them to be bold and remind them of the truths that God has implanted in their hearts. That is how we can sort of feel the fire of passion and conviction, if we are reminding ourselves, speaking to one another and speaking to ourselves. If we spoke to ourselves more than we listened to ourselves, I think often we'd be well served. So Julie, perhaps could you tell us, just give us a few sort of takeaway points from the review, some of the details, and what that could mean for schools? Because obviously there's loads of stuff there. I know it's primarily for the NHS, but is there anything perhaps that could be taken and used as particular kind of backing for the teachers in schools? Sorry if I'm putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So that sort of picks up on what I was just thinking about. So, so I think one of the biggest things is the backing to so this comes out of the CAS review, but also out of the draft guidance from the DFE as well, is that biological sex is vitally important. So I think we had kind of got to a point in schools where people were afraid to talk about biological sex, and kind of saying, well, if I do that, I might lose my job or whatever, but there is clear backing from the DFE and from the CAS review that we must be, we must know children's biological sex, and we must use their biological sex, and we must be careful not to be changing pronouns and things like that, unless maybe in very, very rare situations, possibly. I can't think of any, but there might be where it might be appropriate, but generally not. So I think that is something that I think will be very reassuring for lots of teachers who were feeling uncomfortable about that we must be teaching children clear biological facts. Children, must use toilets, changing rooms, etc., that correspond to their biological sex. They must have their correct sex recorded in the register, all those kind of things. So I think the CAS review clearly picks that up. I think the biggest help from the CAS review with for schools is the stuff on social transition, because that is where the rubber hits the road, really, isn't it, for schools? The whole clothes, changing rooms, toilets, pronouns, names, etc., where schools perhaps felt they were allowing social transition to be kind because it was the loving thing to do, because it seemed to be the best thing to do. But the CAS review is really clear. I mean, I just a quote from the CAS review. It's always good to use the exact words. So they commissioned various bits of research, and one of those was a systematic review. I won't explain what that is, but it's basically looking at lots and lots of studies, and it showed no clear evidence that social transition in childhood has any positive or negative mental health outcomes, and relatively weak evidence for any effect in adolescence as well. However, those who had socially transitioned at an earlier age and prior to being seen in clinic were more likely to proceed to a medical pathway. So there's no evidence that it has a benefit. There's no evidence that it has a negative effect either, other than that it makes it more likely they'll go on to a medical transition, which, of course, there is no evidence that medical transition is helpful. And there's no evidence that medical transition is safe and effective, or that it's a good thing at all. So I think for the teachers who were, felt pushed to be involved in social transition, they now have some really clear evidence where they can say, actually, I don't feel happy about this. I'm not going to get involved in this. So I think those would be the two big things that that are helpful from the review for teachers. And I think also, just picking up on what Steve said, I think the time has come where we have to just be bold and stand up, and trust God. We have to trust God that if it's His will that we get into trouble and lose our jobs, then so be it. But that actually He will use us, and we must stand up for the truth and for the vulnerable. But we have got some evidence to back us up at the moment.
I think as well, I heard Dr. Hilary Cass talk a lot in the wake of this review being released about a holistic approach being absolutely essential, and for kind of frontline or primary care, I guess, in the NHS staff being more empowered to trust their gut that actually this is a child that, or a young person that needs support in the same way that, say, if they came with anxiety or they came with another issue that could be dealt with in a different way, that they would feel empowered to support them much more cautiously and holistically. And that as well should be, I think, the response from educational professionals, acknowledging that actually a lot of these young people will have issues that are multifactorial. Perhaps there's issues of trauma, or autistic spectrum disorder, or other kinds of social pressures as well. And that's not even to mention the impact of social media. But
yeah, I think that is really clear, isn't it? And what comes out in the Cass review, that there's this sort of diagnostic overshadowing and safeguarding overshadowing as well, so that as soon as gender is mentioned, we forget all the normal stuff, all the normal things we would do for children, as you say, but also all the normal safeguarding stuff we would do. I find the Bayswater support group, I'm sure we can put the link in the show notes. They have a great infographic of an iceberg where you see the sort of trans identity is the tip of the iceberg above the water, and underneath all of the so many things that could be being playing out for this young child or young person that we need to think about. So I find that a really helpful way of thinking about it.
Steve, I'm just going to ask you now. You mentioned earlier that these things are kind of embedded, and it's going to be hard to roll back the clock, to rewind on this. What can Christian teachers do if they find that schools are either still using questionable materials or are promoting, I don't know, LGBT clubs, still kind of waving progress pride flags? I mean, is there anything we can do about these things? Does it make a difference whether it's within lesson time or not? How could you help them? What would you advise?
Well, do talk to us at Christian Concern, and we're regularly helping and supporting with kind of bespoke advice where people can explain their individual circumstances. Most situations, there's not one size fits all advice for all occasions, and so do contact us at Christian Concern. Look at our website, look at the resources. We're about to launch a new education website in the next few weeks, which is going to have all sorts of free resources and help and support that will be good for parents and teachers and church leaders as well. So that's a place where you can get support with those kinds of questions. One of the things I would say is do talk to your leaders, do talk to the head teachers, do talk to the governors about the issues and concerns that you have. Leadership matters. And where there is ignorance in the leadership, which I think there is a huge amount of ignorance, you can be a key person in helping them understand what is actually happening, what is actually going on. If you've been prepared to listen to this podcast all the way through, for example, you're probably one of the top 10% of educated teachers on this kind of subject at this very moment in time. So do your research, do your due diligence, and then take what you've understood and what you've learned to your head teacher, to the governors, to key people who are leading in your school context, so that they are aware. If you've got someone who's an activist who is pushing and peddling things, then that's a different kind of situation that you're in, and often teachers are fearful for their jobs, and yet the Lord always gives us ways to be able to approach these things. If we're following Him, He wants to help us. He gives us an advocate called the Holy Spirit, who is pretty powerful. I've known His presence with me in all sorts of very difficult circumstances and situations, and He's led the way. I think the flowing on thought from that is, this is not a battle against flesh and blood. This is a battle against spiritual powers and authorities. There's a reason why this debate gets so polarized and toxic. It's because it's a spiritual thing that's going on. There are other spiritual forces at work that are really trying to damage and destroy children. And guess what? It's going to be a battle to push back against those. So we must pray, we must fast, we must, as you say, gather together with other Christians, so we're not doing this on our own. There shouldn't be Lone Ranger Christians roaming around out there trying to fight the enemy. No, we're a part of an army together in the kingdom of God, seeing his kingdom come, his kingdom advance. And so be salt and light. Don't lose your saltiness. If you're out there sprinkled out in the midst of some difficult circumstances, be as salty as you can be, as you influence your leaders, as you are following Jesus Christ yourself, as he leads you.
So just to kind of finish off this conversation and drawing on that theme of battling and polarized debate, how can we as Christians avoid the heat? So I've been looking a lot on social media, in particular X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. A phrase that I've seen repeated numerous times is, "We've kept the receipts," referring to the fact that, some people are now changing their minds and kind of trying to, perhaps under the radar a bit, to roll back things they've said before. How can we practice forgiveness and reconciliation? How should we be speaking about this topic on social media? What should our tone be?
I've been thinking quite a lot about this, because I think one of the big issues in this is professionals and parents as well, who have gone along with this for whatever reason, often with the best intentions. To roll back on this is going to be really hard, and I think we're going to be dealing with broken young people who've been affected by this ideology and also the medical stuff, but we're also going to be dealing with broken people who have gone down this route because they thought they were genuinely doing the right thing, and they will be distraught, and we need to be, like you say, Lizzie, forgiving, and we need to understand that often they've not done it for the wrong reasons, and we need to allow people a way back, so that they don't feel that they have to dig in, so that they feel like they can go, oh, okay, maybe I got this wrong, and allow them to do that gently. And just because we realised early, it doesn't mean that everybody did. And just because maybe we've had the courage and to speak out, and God has pushed us in that direction. Not everybody has been pushed in that direction, and lots of people will have good reasons why they haven't been a Daniel or an Esther, for using biblical examples. So I think you're right. I think giving people the space, and so that we don't say things in a gotcha way. We don't kind of say, well, now now you've got the evidence. Wake up. But actually, just do it in a gracious and forgiving way.
The other thing I've been noting is that, although I was pleased with the release of this review, I think it would be a shame for this to be a moment of celebration, because this report highlights just how inadequately a vulnerable group of patients have received care, and how easily our institutions have been captured by ideologues. And then our response, though, as Christians, is not to be drawn into bitterness. As you say, if we then become angry and vociferous, that can make people retract and double down. We need to allow them a road back and to be reconciled with the truth again, the truth about gender, and I suppose ultimately the truth about the Lord Jesus. So let's pray that this report can really spur some good dialogue, and we can steer away from that contentious heat. Have we got anything else? Where can we go then if we have any further concerns? Obviously, we can go to Christian Concern. Anywhere else? And Lovewise? Where else can we go?
I mean, I already mentioned the Bayswater Support Group. I mean, the Bayswater Support Group, it is not a Christian organisation, but it is a great organisation that supports parents who have children who are questioning their gender. So I think, they've got lots of good information on their website. So, teachers or parents can go, or teachers can advise parents to go there. So that is a really, really great website, which I would very much recommend people to go to.
I would also, I mean, it's difficult to advocate for your own thing, Lizzie, isn't it? But I think the Association of Christian Teachers is a really good place for Christians to coalesce, to talk about these kinds of issues, to find support. And I'm a member, just to kind of wave the flag there for Association of Christian Teachers. I mean, there's about 500,000 teachers, and there must be tens and tens of thousands of Christians who are teachers, but they're not well connected and supporting each other. And I think the Association of Christian Teachers is the key game in town, I would say. So if you are a teacher and you're listening to this, do encourage other teachers who are Christians to consider joining in.
Well, I'll give you a commission later, Steve. Thanks. No, that's really great. Yeah. Well, all I have to say is thank you so much. Thanks, Julie, for your medical, your kind of long-standing campaigning and lobbying on this, and your knowledge of what it's like to treat children that are questioning their gender. And Steve, thank you so much for your educational input and for all the work you're doing at Christian Concern.